Reentry is the process of leaving prison and returning to a community, and it tells us a lot about what incarceration is. So when people come out of prison, they have to re-establish themselves with their families. If they've been working, they have to find a place once again in the labour market. They have to become members of their community all over again. And we often think of incarceration as a deprivation of liberty. It's something the individual experiences where they no longer have their autonomy. And I think reentry tells us that incarceration is also a social thing. We're cut off from the relationships that are important to us, and in the process of reentry, we try and re-establish those relationships. It's also important because incarceration in America, of course, isn't distributed equally across society. There's a very large racial disparity. African Americans are 5 to 6 times more likely to be in prison. This whole challenge is concentrated in our most disadvantaged communities of colour. So my book, Homeward, is based on the Boston Reentry study, and this was a series of interviews we conducted with men and women, about 135 people altogether we spoke to. And we first spoke to them about a week before they left prison, and then we followed them for 1 year as they left prison and returned to neighbourhoods around the Boston area. So that's one story about the background. At a deeper level, I'd been doing a lot of research on the effects of incarceration. What's the effects of incarceration on employment and earnings? What's the effects of incarceration on family life? And these were large-scale statistical studies looking at survey data. And I was concerned that the kinds of data I was analysing wasn't capturing the lived experience of the process of coming home after prison and getting out into the field and talking to people who have been incarcerated, getting to know them and their stories and their families. This was an important motivation for the Boston study. The first challenge the people we were interviewing faced was the immediate period of transition after incarceration. And so we spoke to people 1 week before they left prison, and then our second interview with them was 2 weeks later in the community. So they had been out of prison just 1 week. And that sometimes was a very happy interview. People were reunited with their families and their kids and their loved ones. And sometimes people were really anxious and really stressed and doing it very hard. Housing was a key challenge, particularly in the early period after prison release. There was virtually no independent housing over the year for the entire sample that we interviewed after prison. Just about everyone was either living with family, so doubling up with family, or they were in some sort of group living situation like a shelter or a sober house, about 50-50. So housing was a really acute challenge. People who come out of prison in many cases have really serious health challenges. They're often in poor physical health, and so rates of chronic pain were very high in the sample. They're dealing with chronic conditions in many cases. Hepatitis, diabetes, asthma were all common among the people that we're interviewing. And they faced a lot of mental illness and a lot of mood disorders, a lot of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and in some cases serious mental illness, psychoses, bipolar disorder. And incredibly challenging for people who have been institutionalized for a long period of time to move into communities, have to deal with all of the difficulties of establishing new relationships while at the same time struggling with physical and mental illness. Healthcare was a very significant challenge. And the final thing was employment. People's incomes were very, very low. Average income over the course of the study was under $1,000 a month. And so on average, people were living below the federal poverty line for an individual living by themselves. So people were exiting prison for poverty for the most part, and oftentimes incomes were extremely low, like about $6,000 over the year, which poverty researchers call deep poverty. It's half the federal poverty line. The main steady source of income was government programs, and so it was things like disability, SSI, and food stamps were really the most regular sources of economic support for those who could break into employment and particularly get steady work in a skilled job. They were having very different outcomes and significantly out of poverty, but that was only a very small number of the people that we interviewed. It's true as a stylized fact that only poor people go to prison. The prison population is overwhelmingly socioeconomically disadvantaged. The average level of schooling of state prisoners is about 10.5 years. So on average, people who go to prison have never finished high school. And we know that the economic opportunities for people who have dropped out of high school are extremely poor. So people were economically struggling before they went into prison. We also know that the footprint of the criminal justice system is confined to a handful of our poorest communities if we're to look at large American cities. So people are coming also from poor neighbourhoods. But then, of course, there are the effects of incarceration on economic opportunities and the disruption of incarceration on people's economic trajectories over the life course. And incarceration is enormously disruptive for people whose economic opportunities are already really bad to begin with. The unemployment rate in the Reentry study sample was about 50% over the year. So in any given month, about half our sample was not working. When they were working, for the most part, the jobs that people were getting were either minimum wage jobs in food service or retail, or they're working casual jobs off the books. And at the time we were in the field, the minimum wage in Massachusetts was $8.50 an hour. People were working short hours, 25 hours a week. You cannot live on that money. Then that's a poverty level wage, and so you need other kinds of economic support. Our sample was very reliant on food stamps. About 85% of the sample were on food stamps, which paid $200 a month, and they're getting a lot of support from family. So this, as much as this is a story about crime and criminal justice, it is equally a story about poverty in America. So it's a complicated story. Family support was enormously important, and if people could move into households immediately after they left prison, their outcomes over the coming year were better than if they were in some sort of group quarters like a shelter, or if they were street homeless. Now, people who were moving in into households were moving in with family. No one was moving into independent housing, and everyone in a household was moving in with family. And often as researchers, we've focused on partners and children as the family supports for people coming out of prison. But we didn't see this in Boston. The big sources of family support that we observed were older women in the communities that people were moving back to. And these older women were mothers, grandmothers, aunts, big sisters, and they were putting up their men, the men in their lives, in their 30s and 40s, sometimes in their 50s, and they were sleeping in spare rooms and on couches. And it provided a huge source of social stability immediately after incarceration. We created a measure of social isolation in the very first week after prison. And for people that scored high on social isolation, disconnected from families, largely idle, inactive in their first week after prison, they were more likely to be unstably housed, they were more likely to be out of work, they were more likely to get a new criminal charge 6 months later. When we look at the entire lives of people who have gone to prison, for us, I think this was a revelation. It wasn't something we were attuned to at the beginning of the research, but the people we were interviewing were telling us about their whole lives, what had happened to them as children, what had happened to them as teenagers and so on. We began to dig deeper into it and ask more about it. And so one of the things that we learned about, which we weren't attuned to initially, was the deep exposure in childhood of our respondents to violence and other trauma. And the exposure to violence and other trauma was extreme. Over half the sample had been physically or sexually abused. Around half the sample lived with other family violence in the home. 40% of our respondents had seen someone killed as a child. So real deep exposure to trauma. That was related to human frailty in adulthood. Impaired physical health, impaired mental health, serious substance use problems, were all associated with childhood exposure to violence and other trauma. And for me, I think there are policy implications. It creates challenges for our policy response to the problem of reentry. It should be trauma-informed, it should be more than trauma-informed, it should be trying to address the pain of trauma in people who pass through the criminal justice system. But I think the big implication is for the ethics of punishment. People who have been involved in serious crime and in many cases serious violence have suffered serious harm themselves. And for me, this is very challenging for the criminal justice system, which tends to divide the world into victims and offenders. And the reality is the people who have been punished harshly are both victims and offenders. And I think we need to reckon with that. I think it creates a deep challenge to our values. And the criminal justice system, I think, is not very good at taking on the entire biographies of people. And yet, I think this is what we have to do to respond in an ethical way to the challenge of violence and crime in society.